They recovered in the fastest rebound in history. Ackman's fund had its best year ever, earning billions. He made money on the downside with volatility insurance in Stage 2, then made even more money on the upside by buying into the fund in Stage 4. That's the pattern executed perfectly. Now, this is where it connects to the imperial cycle in a way most people never see. These aren't separate events. The financial collapse and the imperial decline are inextricably linked. Let me show you how. Whenever an empire enters the stages of military overextension and currency debasement, it creates the exact conditions for massive financial bubbles. Think of it this way. When the government is spending enormous amounts on war, when it's printing money to finance those expenditures, when it's keeping interest rates artificially low to make debt manageable, it's injecting massive liquidity into the financial system. That liquidity has to go somewhere. It doesn't go to the productive economy because, as we saw with Spain, declining empires lose productive capacity. So where does it go? To speculation, to asset markets, to bubbles. In the 1920s, liquidity flowed into stocks. Everyone was buying shares with borrowed money at a 90% markup because money was cheap and the market kept rising. In the 2000s, liquidity flowed into housing. Everyone was buying houses with mortgages they couldn't afford because money was cheap and housing prices kept rising. And now, in 2024 and 2025, that liquidity is everywhere. In tech stocks trading at nonsensical valuations, in commercial real estate that's empty but still overvalued, in corporate debt that will never be repaid, in cryptocurrencies with no fundamental value. The pattern is always the same. The declining empire floods the system with money to finance its unsustainable commitments. That money creates bubbles. The bubbles eventually burst. And when they burst, a small group that understood the pattern becomes enormously wealthy, while everyone else loses everything. But here's the darker side of this cycle, and it's something we need to talk about directly. Who exactly are these groups that benefit, and how do they manipulate the system to ensure they can continue to benefit generation after generation? Because we're not just talking about savvy investors who see things coming. We're talking about entire family dynasties, massive corporations, and networks of political power that have turned war and economic collapse into business models they've perfected over more than a century. Let me show you something that will completely transform your understanding of how American capitalism really works. There is a business model in American history that is more profitable than oil, more consistent than banking, and more protected than any monopoly. It has enriched the same families for 6 generations, created dynasties that control billions in assets, and funded political careers, university endowments, and charitable foundations. And it's based on a simple premise: profiting from war. Every war, any war. Because while soldiers die and taxpayers pay, a small group of companies always wins. Let's start with the family that literally invented the American military-industrial complex, the DuPont family. If you've heard of them, it's probably because of chemicals or Teflon. But the DuPont fortune was built on gunpowder, and they've supplied explosives for every American war since 1802. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont arrived in the United States from France in the 1800s. He was a trained chemist who had worked in French gunpowder mills and saw an opportunity. The United States had just emerged from a revolution and was expanding westward. This meant a constant need for explosives, for land clearing, for mining, and for warfare. In 1802, he founded the DuPont Company on the Brandywine River in Delaware. The location was strategic, close to Philadelphia and Washington, with access to hydroelectric power for mills, and far enough from cities that explosions wouldn't cause political problems. By the time of the 1812 war, DuPont was supplying gunpowder to the US Army. This was its first major government contract, and it established a pattern that would repeat itself for 2 centuries. War begins. The government needs explosives. DuPont is ready with existing capacity. They get the contract. They expand production. They make huge profits. The war ends. They keep the infrastructure and wait for the next one. During the Mexican-American War of 1846-1848, DuPont supplied gunpowder for artillery and small arms. The contract was worth more than $1 million, roughly $35 million in today's money. But the real value was establishing DuPont as the government's preferred supplier. When you're the company that delivered during the last war, you're first in line for the next one. The Civil War, from 1861 to 1865, was DuPont's big break. The Union Army needed gunpowder on an unprecedented scale. 4 years of continuous warfare, hundreds of battles, millions of rounds fired. DuPont's mills operated around the clock. They produced more than 4 million pounds of gunpowder. The contracts were worth more than $10 million. That's more than 300 million today. And that's just direct sales. DuPont also sold to private contractors who then sold back to the government at an additional markup. This is where it gets interesting. The DuPont family were Northern Democrats. They opposed abolition. Some family members even politically supported the Confederacy. But they sold gunpowder to the Union because that's where the contracts were. Ideology didn't matter. Profit did. And after the war, when the Union won, DuPont was portrayed as a patriotic company that helped save the nation. The complexity of their true position was forgotten. Only profit remained. World War I, from 1914 to 1918, transformed DuPont from a large company into a dynasty. Before the United States entered the war in 1917, DuPont sold explosives to Great Britain and France, millions of pounds of gunpowder, TNT, and smokeless powder. When the United States joined the war, DuPont's production increased exponentially. They built new plants, hired thousands of workers, and supplied 40% of all the explosives used by the Allied forces. The profits were staggering. DuPont's net profits jumped from $5 million in 1914 to $82 million in 1918. That's over $1 billion today. In 4 years, profits increased by 1,600%. And here's the critical detail. After the war, they didn't give that money back. They diversified into chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials. They used their war profits to build a peacetime empire. But they didn't stop selling to the military. World War II brought another increase. DuPont supplied explosives, nylon for parachutes, and worked on the Manhattan Project. They operated the plutonium production facility in Hanford, Washington. The contract was a cost-plus agreement, meaning they were paid all their expenses plus a guaranteed profit. They couldn't lose money. The government absorbed all the risk. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. In every conflict, DuPont or its successor companies supplied materials. By the 2000s, DuPont's defense division had been spun off and merged with other companies, but the family wealth remained. The DuPont Family Trust is valued at approximately $30 billion. 6 generations removed from Eleuthère, and they are still living off the profits from gunpowder. Now let's talk about the Rockefellers. Oil, the one resource every modern army needs, and the family that monopolized it for a century. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. By 1880, he controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. This wasn't a business, it was a monopoly. And when America went to war, that monopoly became a strategic asset. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was small but significant. The US Navy transitioned from coal to oil-powered ships in the 1890s. This made Standard Oil essential. Naval vessels needed fuel oil. The war lasted only a few months, but it established oil as a military necessity. Rockefeller supplied fuel for the fleet and learned a valuable lesson. Control the fuel, control the military. World War I was the first industrial war where oil was decisive. Tanks, trucks, airplanes, ships all required petroleum products. And Standard Oil, though broken up by antitrust action in 1911, still dominated through its successor companies. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, all controlled by Rockefeller. They supplied fuel to the US military and the Allies. The contracts were worth hundreds of millions. But this is where the Rockefeller strategy differed from DuPont's. They didn't just sell to one side. Standard Oil's German subsidiary sold fuel to Germany. Even after the United States entered the war, the Rockefeller companies traded with Germany through neutral countries. This wasn't treason. It was business. And it was legal because the companies were technically separate entities. The profits from both sides of World War I made the Rockefellers the wealthiest family in America. John D. Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire, and the family diversified into banking, real estate, and philanthropy. But oil remained the foundation. World War II saw the same pattern. Rockefeller companies supplied fuel to the US military. Exclusive contracts, cost-plus prices, guaranteed profits. Standard Oil of New Jersey, Exxon's predecessor, was investigated for trading with Nazi Germany through subsidiaries. The investigation found that Standard Oil had shared synthetic rubber patents with the German chemical company IG Farben even after the war had begun. This gave Germany access to technology that prolonged the war. Senator Harry Truman, before becoming president, led the investigation. His committee concluded that Standard Oil's actions had harmed the war effort. But no one was prosecuted. The company was too important. The military needed its fuel. So the investigation was quietly shelved, and the contracts continued. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. Every conflict required oil. And Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, the Rockefeller successor companies, supplied it. The profits were so enormous that by the 1970s, the Rockefeller family began divesting from oil to avoid political scrutiny. But the wealth remained. The Rockefeller family fortune is estimated at $11 billion today, built on oil sold to armies that burned it while fighting wars. Now, the Morgan banking dynasty. War financing. Because wars don't just need weapons and fuel. They need money, and the people who lend that money profit regardless of who wins. J.P. Morgan founded his banking empire in the 1870s. By 1900, J.P. Morgan and Company was the most powerful bank in the United States. And Morgan understood something that would define a century of war profits. Governments at war will borrow at any rate. They have no choice. The alternative is to lose. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was financed in part through loans from Morgan to the US government. Small war, small loans. But it established the relationship. The government trusted Morgan, and Morgan profited from the interest. World War I was different. When war broke out in Europe in 1914, the United States was officially neutral. But American banks, led by J.P. Morgan, lent money to Great Britain and France. More than $2 billion between 1914 and 1917. That's more than $50 billion today. The loans were used to buy weapons, food, and supplies, mostly from American companies. Then, American banks lent money to the Allies, who spent it buying from American companies. The money circulated, but the profits stayed on both sides. Here's the critical detail. Those loans made American neutrality impossible. By 1917, Great Britain and France owed so much to American banks that their defeat would have caused a financial crisis in the United States. If they lost the war, they couldn't pay. American banks would collapse. The economy would crash. So when President Wilson asked Congress to declare war in April 1917, it wasn't just about democracy or German aggression. It was about protecting American financial interests. Senator George Norris of Nebraska said it explicitly during the declaration of war debate. "We are going to war on the orders of gold. We are about to put the dollar sign on the American flag." He voted against the war, but Congress voted for it. And J.P. Morgan's loans were secured by American military power. After the war, Morgan profited again. Germany owed reparations to the Allies. The Allies owed money to the United States. Morgan arranged the loans that allowed Germany to pay reparations, which the Allies used to repay the American loans. Morgan charged fees at every step. The Dawes Plan in 1924 and the Young Plan in 1929. both structured by Morgan bankers, refinanced billions in war debt, and Morgan collected millions in fees. World War II followed the same pattern. Before the United States entered the war, Morgan banks financed British war purchases. After Pearl Harbor, the US government borrowed heavily to finance the war effort. War bonds, Treasury securities, were underwritten by Morgan banks, which charged fees on each issue. And after the war, Morgan banks financed reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe, was administered in part through institutions connected to Morgan. The Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, every conflict required financing, and Morgan banks, by then merged into J.P. Morgan Chase, were always involved, underwriting government debt, financing defense contractors, and profiting from interest and fees. The Morgan family is no longer involved in day-to-day banking, but the wealth remains. The family fortune is estimated at $30 billion, built on lending money for wars and collecting interest, while soldiers died paying the price. Now Lockheed Martin, or more accurately, the companies that merged to become Lockheed Martin. Because military aviation has been profitable since World War I. The Lougheed brothers, later spelled Lockheed, founded their aircraft company in 1912. By World War I, they were building planes for the military, small contracts, experimental designs. But aviation was the future, and the companies that got in early positioned themselves for a century of profits. World War I saw limited use of airplanes, mainly reconnaissance and some bombing. But the potential was clear. After the war, military aviation contracts dried up. Many aircraft companies went bankrupt. Lockheed survived by building civilian aircraft, but they maintained their military connections. World War II was the turning point. Airplanes were crucial. Bombers, fighters, transports, all essential. Lockheed built the P-38 Lightning fighter. More than 10,000 were produced. They built the Hudson bomber. More than 2,800 were produced. The contracts were worth hundreds of millions. But here's Lockheed's innovation. They didn't just build airplanes. They cultivated relationships with the Pentagon. They hired former military officers as executives. They located factories in congressional districts where representatives needed jobs for their constituents. They made themselves politically untouchable. After World War II, the Cold War kept the contracts flowing. Lockheed built the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the C-130 cargo plane, still in use today. Each decade brought new contracts, and Lockheed's strategy was always the same. Build good enough products, underestimate the costs, get the contract, then come back for more money because the project is more complex than expected. The Pentagon always paid because cancelling a project meant admitting to waste. The C-5 Galaxy transport aircraft is the perfect example. The initial contract in 1965 was for $2.1 billion. By the time of delivery, the actual cost was $5.3 billion, 150% over budget. Did Lockheed lose money? No. It was a cost-plus contract. They were paid all costs plus profit. The Pentagon couldn't cancel because they had already spent billions. So they paid. Lockheed profited. And Congress approved it because the factory employed thousands in Georgia, a key state, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq. Each conflict brought contracts to Lockheed. By the 1990s, the military-industrial complex was consolidating. Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta in 1995 to become Lockheed Martin. Today, they are the world's largest defense contractor. $65 billion in revenue in 2023, 90% of which came from government contracts. And the pattern continues. The F-35 fighter jet, the most expensive weapons program in history. Original budget of $233 billion. Current estimate of over $1.7 trillion. That's a trillion with a capital T, 7 times over budget. And Lockheed is being paid. Every cost overrun, the Pentagon covers because they can't cancel. Too much invested. Too many jobs at stake. Too many congressional districts dependent on the program. The Lockheed family no longer directly controls the company. It's publicly traded. but the shareholders profit, and the pattern established over a century continues. War is declared. Lockheed's stock price rises. Contracts are awarded. Costs are exceeded. The government pays. The shareholders profit. Repeat. Now, Halliburton. Military logistics. The company that turned war support into an art form. Halliburton was founded in 1919 by Earl Halliburton. Initially, it was an oil field services company that cemented oil wells. But the founder understood that infrastructure, whether for oil or military purposes, was lucrative. By World War II, Halliburton was building bases, airfields, and ports for the military. The pattern was simple. The military needed infrastructure fast. Halliburton had the expertise and the equipment. They won no-bid contracts because there wasn't time for competitive bidding. They built the facility. The cost-plus contract meant they were paid all their expenses plus a guaranteed profit. They couldn't afford to lose money. Korea saw Halliburton build bases and infrastructure. Vietnam was bigger. Halliburton, through its subsidiary Brown & Root, built roads, ports, and airfields throughout South Vietnam. The contracts were worth billions and were awarded without competitive bidding because Brown & Root had political connections. This is where the political connection becomes critical. George Brown, founder of Brown & Root, was a major donor to Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson's political career was partially funded by Brown. When Johnson became president, Brown & Root secured massive infrastructure contracts for Vietnam. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the pattern is clear. Political donations, access to power, government contracts, profit. The Gulf War in 1991 brought Halliburton back into the spotlight. Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense. Halliburton secured contracts to build facilities in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. After the war, Cheney left the government and became CEO of Halliburton in 1995. He led the company until 2000, when he became vice president under George W. Bush. And then came Iraq and Afghanistan. Halliburton, through its subsidiary KBR, secured contracts worth more than $40 billion. No-bid contracts, cost-plus prices. Halliburton built bases, provided food services, supplied fuel, and managed logistics. And the costs were astronomical. The Pentagon's Inspector General found billions in waste and overcharges. Halliburton billed the government for meals that were never served, for fuel deliveries that never happened, for construction that was never completed. And when questioned, Halliburton argued that war zones are chaotic and some waste is inevitable. The government agreed and kept paying. As vice president, Dick Cheney recused himself from contract decisions involving Halliburton. But his former company won more contracts during his tenure than in any previous period. From 2003 to 2008, Halliburton's government contracts increased by 400%. Its stock price tripled. And when Cheney left office in 2009, he still held options on Halliburton's stock worth millions. This is the pattern. The company hires politicians as executives. Those executives build relationships within the government. When wars begin, those relationships translate into contracts. And the profits are shared. The politicians retire wealthy, the companies get richer, and the taxpayers foot the bill. Now let me show you the pattern across all 5 companies, because it's not just that these families profited from the war, it's how they profited. The same strategy repeated for 150 years. Step 1. Positioning before the war. The 5 companies established themselves as essential before the conflict began. DuPont built explosives manufacturing capacity during peacetime. Rockefeller monopolized oil refining. Morgan built banking relationships. Lockheed maintained military contracts between wars. Halliburton built infrastructure expertise. When the war started, they were ready. Their competitors were not. Step 2. Get the first contract. The government needs supplies immediately. There's no time for competitive bidding. Established companies get contracts without competition. The justification is always national security. We can't wait for bidding, we need it now. And once you have the first contract, The following ones are easier. You're the proven supplier. Step 3. Cost plus pricing. Almost all major wartime contracts from the Civil War onward were cost plus pricing. The contractor bills the government for all costs plus a guaranteed profit margin. This eliminates all risk. If costs are exceeded, the government pays. If the project takes longer, the contractor earns more profit. The incentive is to maximize costs, not minimize them. Step 4. Exceed the budget. Every major weapons system in the last 50 years has gone over budget. The F-35 7 times over budget. The Zumwalt destroyer 3 times over budget. The littoral combat ship twice over. This isn't incompetence, it's the business model. Underestimate to get the contract, then revise the estimates upward. The government can't cancel because they've already invested, so they pay, and the contractor profits from the cost overrun. Step 5. Hire the regulators. When military officers retire, where do they go? Defense contractors. The generals who approve Lockheed contracts become Lockheed executives. The admirals who oversaw shipbuilding join shipbuilding companies. The revolving door between the Pentagon and industry is so entrenched it has a name. And it ensures that the people who award contracts maintain relationships that will benefit them later. Step 6. Lobby for more war. This is the darkest part. Defense contractors spend millions lobbying Congress. They donate to campaigns. They fund think tanks that produce papers advocating for military intervention. The Center for Strategic and International Studies and the American Enterprise Institute both received funding from defense contractors, and both consistently published research supporting military action. When Iraq was being debated in 2002, defense contractors funded organizations that produced intelligence reports supporting the invasion. They paid for advertisements. They hired former generals to appear on news programs advocating for the war. And when the war was approved, those same contractors received billions in contracts. Did they create the Iraq War? No, but they created an environment where war was more likely, and they profited when it happened. Step 7. Diversify the profits. War profits don't stay tied up in weapons. DuPont used profits from explosives to build a chemical empire. Rockefeller used profits from oil to buy banks and real estate. Morgan used profits from war loans to finance peacetime industries. Companies diversify so that even when wars end, the wealth remains, and the families behind these companies become dynasties. Multi-generational wealth built on war. Now let me show you the scale. How much profit are we talking about? DuPont's total revenue from military contracts since 1802 is estimated at over $50 billion, adjusted for inflation. The Rockefeller companies, over $100 billion in fuel sales to the military since 1898. The Morgan banks, interest and fees from war financing estimated at over $75 billion. Lockheed Martin and its predecessors, over $200 billion in aircraft and systems since 1917. Halliburton, over $60 billion in logistics and infrastructure since 1942. In total, these 5 companies and their predecessors have extracted over $485 billion from American taxpayers through wartime contracts. That's documented with publicly available contract values. Available. It does not include indirect profits, increases in stock prices, real estate purchased with war profits, or industries built using war capital. If you include those, the number exceeds $1 trillion. And here's the critical detail. That money came from taxpayers. Every dollar paid to DuPont for explosives was taken from American workers through taxes. Every dollar paid to Halliburton for logistics came from deficit spending that future generations will pay for. These aren't normal business profits. These are public funds transferred into private hands, justified by war. Now, the question you should be asking is this still happening? Yes. Right now. Let me show you the current numbers. In 2023, the US military budget was $816 billion. The 5 largest defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman received over $200 billion in contracts. That's 25% of the entire defense budget going to 5 companies. And the pattern continues. These companies employ former Pentagon officials. They lobby Congress. They strategically locate factories. The F-35 program, built by Lockheed, has suppliers in 45 states. That's intentional. It means that 90 senators have constituents employed by the program. Voting against F-35 means voting against jobs in your state. So Congress continues to fund it, even though it's 7 times over budget, even though it's years behind schedule, even though it has more than 800 documented defects. The pattern established by DuPont in 1802 continues today. Warfare is profitable for the companies, for the shareholders, for the executives, for the politicians who receive donations and jobs after retirement. The only people who don't benefit are the soldiers fighting and the taxpayers paying for it. Now, let me show you something that should infuriate you. Opportunity cost. What could the United States have built with $485 billion if it hadn't gone to war profits? $485 billion could fund free college for every American student for 20 years. It could build high-speed trains connecting every major city. It could fund universal health care for a decade. It could rebuild every bridge and highway in the country. It could fund cancer research for a century. But instead, they bought explosives, fuel, weapons, and logistical support for wars. Some were necessary, many were not. And the companies profited while the public good suffered. This isn't about whether the wars were justified. Some were. World War II was necessary, but even necessary wars were exploited for profit. And many wars were encouraged, prolonged, or escalated because it was profitable. Vietnam could have ended years earlier, but defense contractors lobbied to continue. Iraq was sold off with false intelligence, some of it produced by contractor-funded think tanks. Afghanistan became a 20-year occupation, in part because contractors made billions rebuilding what we destroyed. The profit motive didn't create these wars, but it made them longer and more expensive than they needed to be. Here's the final piece of the puzzle. Families are untouchable. Despite evidence of overcharging, fraud, and profit-driven warfare, no one goes to jail. DuPont was investigated for monopolistic practices in explosives in the 1930s. Nothing happened. Standard Oil was broken up for monopoly, but the Rockefellers retained their wealth, and the companies eventually reunited. Morgan banks were investigated for war profits after World War I. No prosecutions. Halliburton was investigated for overcharging in Iraq. They paid a fine, kept their contracts, and continued to profit. Lockheed was investigated for bribing foreign officials to buy weapons. They paid a fine. The executives faced no prison time. The pattern is consistent. Investigations uncover irregularities. Fines are paid. The fines are a fraction of the profits. No individuals are prosecuted. The companies continue to operate. The pattern persists because these companies are too important to prosecute. The military relies on them. Congress relies on them for jobs in its districts. The economy relies on them. So they are protected even when they break the law. 5 families, 5 companies, 150 years, every major American war. And the pattern is identical every time. Position yourself before the war. Secure the contracts. Exceed costs. Hire regulators. Lobby for more. Profit while others die. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented history. The contracts are public. The profits are recorded. The pattern is undeniable. And it's still happening right now. But now I need to show you how all of this connects back to the larger imperial cycle. Because this is where the full picture becomes devastatingly clear. The war profit cycle I just described doesn't just coexist with imperial decline. It actively accelerates it. There's a pattern in the history of capitalism that repeats itself with mathematical precision roughly every 100 years. It's not a coincidence. It's not luck. It's a cycle that combines war, financial speculation, and economic collapse. And if you understand how it works, you'll see that we're at exactly the same point in the cycle as we were in 1929, as we were in 1914, as we were in the moments leading up to every major imperial crisis. Let me show you something that will completely change your understanding of how economic power really works. I've spent over 50 years studying economics, teaching at universities, analyzing financial crises and imperial systems, and there's something I've learned that you'll never find in conventional textbooks. Empires don't fall by accident. They fall following a predictable pattern, a sequence of stages that has repeated itself time and again throughout history. And the most terrifying feature of this pattern is that always, in every cycle, a small group of people become enormously wealthy, while millions lose everything. We are talking about three elements that are inevitably intertwined: imperial expansion through war, rampant financial speculation that creates unsustainable bubbles, and economic collapse that destroys the working class but enriches those who saw it coming. This pattern has destroyed entire empires. Spain in the 17th century, Great Britain in the 20th, the Soviet Union just 30 years ago. And now, in 2025, the United States is following precisely the same path, step by step. But before I show you where we are in the current cycle, you need to understand how this pattern works. Not from the perspective of official history books that glorify empire and justify wars, but from the perspective of real political economy, of the materialist analysis of how capital moves, how it accumulates, and how it destroys in the process. Let's begin with Spain, the first true global empire. In 1500, after Columbus arrived in the Americas, Spain became the dominant power in the world. They conquered the Aztec and Inca empires and took control of the richest gold and silver mines ever discovered. By 1550, Spanish galleons were bringing home 200 tons of silver a year. By 1600, that figure had risen to over 400 tons annually. Spain literally controlled Europe's money supply. The Spanish real was the global reserve currency. Everyone wanted Spanish silver, and this is where the pattern begins. When an empire controls the world's money, it develops an illusion of invincibility. It believes that economic rules don't apply to it. Spain thought exactly that. King Philip II, who reigned from 1556 to 1598, had more money than any monarch in history up to that point. And he spent it all on the empire. First stage of the cycle: military overextension. Spain fought wars everywhere simultaneously. Against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, against France in Italy, against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, against the British Navy, wars in the Philippines, wars in the Americas. By 1580, Spain had military commitments on 4 continents. The cost was astronomical. Half of all of Spain's revenue went to the army. And even then, it wasn't enough. This is where the second stage comes in: currency debasement. The Spanish government couldn't pay its bills with taxes alone. So they did what every declining empire does. They debased the currency. They began mixing copper into silver coins. A coin that was supposed to be pure silver became 50% copper, then 75% copper. The face value remained the same, but the real value plummeted. Merchants stopped accepting them at face value. Inflation exploded. Third stage: a spiral of debt. Spain borrowed constantly. From Italian bankers, from German bankers, from anyone who would lend. By 1557, less than 20 years into Philip's reign, Spain declared bankruptcy. They defaulted on their debts, restructured, and continued borrowing. They declared bankruptcy again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596. 4 bankruptcies in 40 years. Each time they promised reforms. Each time they went straight back to borrowing and spending. But here's the part most historians don't understand, and it's crucial. The 4th stage: the loss of productive capacity. Spain had all the gold and silver in the world, and that's what destroyed them. Because when you have unlimited money, you stop producing. Why grow food when you can import it? Why build ships when you can buy them? Why innovate when you can simply spend? The Spanish nobility considered labor beneath them. Manufacturing declined. Agriculture stagnated. All the wealth flowed into importing goods from other countries. The gold and silver that came from the Americas went directly back to pay for French wine, Italian silk, and Dutch products. Spain became a conduit. Wealth flowed through them, but nothing stayed. By 1600, Spain was producing almost nothing. They were completely dependent on imports, completely dependent on silver to pay for everything. And when the silver mines began to run dry, when production fell, the whole system collapsed. Fifth stage, social decline. With the economy failing, crime exploded. Beggars filled the streets of Madrid. Productive citizens emigrated. The best minds left for France, England, the Netherlands, countries that were building, creating, and growing. Spain was left with bureaucrats, soldiers, and priests. No one creating wealth, everyone consuming it. By 1640, Spain had lost Portugal. By 1650, they had lost the Netherlands, their richest territory. By 1700, the Spanish Empire was an empty shell, still large on maps, but economically dead. They went from a global superpower to a secondary power in less than a century, and never recovered. Spain today is a regional European country, pleasant, cultured, but irrelevant on the world stage. The descendants of the conquerors are a tourist destination. That's what the imperial collapse looks like. And the pattern that destroyed them would be repeated in exactly the same way 300 years later. Let's fast forward 3 centuries. Great Britain in 1900. At its height, Great Britain controlled 25% of the world's landmass, 400 million subjects. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Every major commercial contract was denominated in pounds. Every central bank held British bonds. London was the financial centre of the world. And like Spain 300 years earlier, they believed it was permanent. But they were already following the pattern. First stage, military overextension. By 1900, Britain had military commitments everywhere. India, Africa, the Middle East, China, the Pacific, the Caribbean. They had to defend territory on 6 continents. The cost was enormous, and when World War I began in 1914, Britain faced a choice: remain neutral and let Europe destroy itself, or jump in and break up the empire to win. They chose to fight. World War I cost Britain over $40 billion. That's $1 trillion in today's money. They borrowed from everyone, mostly the United States. By 1918, Britain owed America billions. The creditor had become the debtor, but they had won the war. They kept the empire. They thought they could rebuild. They were wrong. Second stage, currency debasement. The pound sterling was supposed to be backed by gold, but the war had depleted Britain's gold reserves. They had sent gold to America to pay for weapons, food, and supplies. By 1920, Britain's gold reserves were half of what they had been in 1914. But they tried to maintain the value of the pound anyway. They returned to the gold standard at the pre-war rate in 1925. The problem? The pound was overvalued. British exports became too expensive, manufacturing declined, unemployment rose, and the government had to keep interest rates high to defend the currency. This devastated the domestic economy. By 1931, they could no longer sustain it. Great Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound lost 25% of its value overnight. The global reserve currency had just admitted it could not keep its promises. Third stage, debt spiral. Britain never recovered from the debt of the First World War. And then the Second World War began. Another $120 billion in costs. More borrowing from America. By 1945, Britain owed the United States and Canada more than $30 billion, more than Britain's entire GDP. The war was won, but the empire was finished. They could no longer defend it. They could no longer afford it. They could no longer maintain it. Fourth stage, loss of the empire. In 1947, Great Britain relinquished India, the jewel in the crown, the source of wealth for 200 years. It was gone. Over the next 20 years, they lost everything: Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean. By 1970, the British Empire existed only in history books. Fifth stage, currency collapse. The pound continued to fall. 1940, £1 was worth $4.03. By 1950, $2.80. By 1970, $2.40. By 1980, $2.30. Today, $1.27. The global reserve currency became a regional currency. Great Britain tried to maintain the pretense: permanent seat on the UN Security Council, nuclear weapons, special relationship with America. But everyone knew the truth. They were a former superpower, a museum of what used to be greatness. The empire was gone and never returned. And here's the fascinating part. While Britain was collapsing, a small group was becoming enormously wealthy. Let me show you how. Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy dynasty, was one of the most successful stock market speculators of the 1920s. He had made millions running stock schemes, coordinated purchases that drove up prices so insiders could sell at the peak. By the summer of 1929, Kennedy controlled significant positions in multiple stocks, but he began to sell. The famous story goes that he decided to get out after his shoeshine boy gave him stock market advice. If the shoeshine boys were speculating, Kennedy reasoned, there was no one left to buy. That's the anecdote. The reality was more calculated. Kennedy understood leverage and forced liquidation. By 1929, margin debt had reached unprecedented levels. Investors were borrowing 90% of the stock's value to buy more stock. Kennedy knew that a 10% drop would wipe out the leveraged investors, triggering margin calls and forced selling that would escalate into panic. So Kennedy liquidated throughout the summer and early fall of 1929. He wasn't alone. Bernard Baruch, another legendary investor who had made fortunes in previous panics, was also turning to cash. Baruch had lived through the panic of 1907 and recognized the signs. By September 1929, both Kennedy and Baruch were substantially out of the market. The Dow peaked on September 3rd at 381. The crash began on October 24th, Black Thursday, 7 weeks later. Kennedy and Baruch had exited at the top. But here's the part you need to understand. They didn't just exit. They built short positions. After Kennedy and Baruch exited their long positions, they began building short positions. Short selling means borrowing shares, selling them at current prices, and hoping to buy them back cheaper later. If you short a stock at $100 and it falls to $50, you make $50 per share. Kennedy established short positions in multiple stocks during the summer and early fall of 1929. He was paying borrowing costs, a form of premium, while the stocks continued to rise. But he understood that when the crash came, these positions would explode in value. The collapse began on October 24th, Black Thursday. By the end of October, stocks had fallen 30%. By November, they were down 50%. In 3 years, the market plummeted 89% from peak to trough. Kennedy made millions from his short positions. Exact figures are not public, because disclosure requirements didn't exist then. But estimates based on his known accumulation of wealth suggest Kennedy earned between $15 and $50 million shorting. That's equivalent to several $100 million today. And here's the crucial point. Kennedy didn't cause the crash. The crash was inevitable due to rampant speculation, excessive leverage, and a lack of regulation. But Kennedy saw it coming and positioned himself to profit. And then, in the final stages, he bought everything at fire sale prices. Kennedy deployed his cash to buy stocks and real estate at depression prices. He bought distressed properties from owners facing foreclosure. He bought businesses being liquidated at auction. He bought stocks trading for less than the cash on their balance sheets. companies that were fundamentally sound, but whose stock prices had collapsed in the panic. By the mid-1930s, Kennedy was one of the richest men in America. His fortune had multiplied, while everyone else was losing everything. Getting out in Stage 1 and shorting in Stages 2 and 3 had made him money. But Stage 4, buying at the absolute bottom, created generational wealth that would fund the Kennedy political dynasty for generations. Now let's move on to the most recent example, the Soviet Union, from 1945 to 1991. After World War II, the USSR emerged as a superpower. Nuclear weapons, a massive military, control over Eastern Europe, satellites in space. And they believed they were the future. Communism would bury capitalism. The Soviet model would dominate. For 45 years, they competed with America. They matched them militarily, building more tanks, more missiles, more troops. But beneath the surface, the economy was dying. First stage, military overextension. The Soviet Union spent 15 to 20% of its GDP on the military. That's 3 times what America spent. They had to match American technology, American reach, and American alliances. But their economy was a fraction of the size. They were in Afghanistan, pro-PD up Cuba, supporting Syria, Vietnam, North Korea, Angola, Ethiopia. Everywhere America had influence, they had to counter it. The cost was unsustainable. Second stage, economic stagnation. The Soviet economy stopped growing in the 1970s. Oil revenues kept it afloat, but nothing else worked. Factories churned out junk. Farms failed. Technology lagged decades behind. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was importing grain. A country with some of the best farmland on Earth couldn't feed itself. Why? Because central planning doesn't work. Because innovation stifles control. Because no one produces when there's no incentive. Third stage, currency collapse. The ruble was never a real currency. It couldn't be exchanged internationally. Even Soviet citizens didn't trust it. They used dollars whenever they could get them. The government had to buy foreign goods with gold and oil because nobody wanted rubles. By 1985, oil prices had plummeted. Soviet gold reserves were dwindling. They were running out of real money. Fourth stage, loss of the empire. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Eastern Europe was gone. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany, all disappeared within a year. The satellites that gave the Soviet Union strategic depth vanished. The Soviet government couldn't stop it. They were bankrupt. Fifth stage, complete collapse. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. 900 days from the fall of the Berlin Wall to complete dissolution. No war, no invasion, only economic implosion. The army could not be paid. The government could not function. The ruble became worthless. A superpower with 30,000 nuclear weapons collapsed due to internal economic failure. The pattern repeated itself. Overextension, currency failure, debt, loss of empire, collapse. And here's what should keep you up at night. The United States is following the exact same pattern. Let me show you where we are now, step by step. Step 1. Military overextension. The United States has over 750 military bases in 80 countries. We have troops in 150 countries. We are committed to defending Europe through NATO, defending Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, fighting in the Middle East, countering China, and countering Russia. Our military budget is $850 billion annually, more than the next 10 countries combined. And it's not enough. We're stretched to the limit. Our equipment is aging, recruitment is low, and we have commitments we can't keep. If China invades Taiwan, if Russia advances into NATO territory, if Iran closes the Persian Gulf, we can't respond to everything at once. We're overextended. Exactly like Spain, like Great Britain, like the USSR. Second stage, currency debasement. In 1971, Nixon closed the gold standard. The dollar became purely fiat currency. Since 2000, the money supply has increased by 400%. Since 2020, we have printed more than $6 trillion. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1971. We're not mixing copper into silver coins. We're just printing unlimited paper. The mechanism is different. The result is the same. Degradation. Third stage, debt spiral. The United States owes $36 trillion. That's 120% of GDP. Interest payments alone are approaching $1 trillion a year. We're spending more on interest than on defense. We have deficits every year. $1.8 trillion in 2024 in a growing economy. During peacetime, we're borrowing to pay interest on previous loans. That's the definition of a debt spiral. Spain defaulted 4 times. Great Britain borrowed until it collapsed. The USSR ran out of money. We're on the same path. Fourth stage, loss of productive capacity. America no longer makes things. We design, finance, consume, but we don't produce. Our manufacturing base has been gutted, sent to China, Mexico, Vietnam. We import $800 billion more than we export annually. We depend on foreign supply chains for everything: medicines, electronics, steel, even military components. Just as Spain became dependent on imports as money flowed out, we depend on imports as dollars flow out. And just like Spain, when the money stops flowing, we're in trouble. Fifth stage, social decay. Trust in institutions is at an all-time low. Crime is rising. Homelessness is exploding. Drug overdoses kill 100,000 Americans annually. The best and brightest are leaving or disengaging. Fertility rates are collapsing. Political dysfunction is total. We can't agree on anything. We can't fix anything. We can't build anything. The signs of decline are everywhere, but everyone pretends it's fine. It's not fine. We're at stage 5 of 7. The Soviet Union reached stage 5 before complete collapse. So did Britain. Spain lasted longer, but the pattern is the same. We're not at the end yet, but we're deep into the sequence. Stage 6 is the loss of reserve currency status. That's when allies start diversifying, when trade moves to other currencies, when the dollar comes flooding back home because nobody needs to hold it anymore. We're seeing early signs. The BRICS nations are developing alternatives. Central banks are buying gold. China and Russia are trading in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan for oil. The cracks are forming. Stage 7 is collapse, not gradual decline, sudden implosion. The Soviet Union went from superpower to non-existence in 900 days. Britain lost its empire in 20 years. Spain took longer. But the result was the same. When the reserve currency fails, when debt becomes unmanageable, when the military can no longer be funded, it doesn't decline gracefully. It collapses quickly and brutally. But now, let me show you the part that connects all of this. How certain groups and individuals not only survive these collapses, but become massively wealthy during them. Because this is where the cycle becomes truly revealing. While empires follow this 7-stage pattern toward collapse, a parallel pattern unfolds in the financial world. A 4-stage cycle that certain investors and institutions follow with mechanical precision. And what's fascinating is that this financial cycle is perfectly synchronized with the imperial cycle. As the empire overextends, debases its currency, and sinks into debt, these financial players are executing their own profit sequence. Let me show you how this worked in 2008 and how it's happening exactly now in 2025. Michael Burry ran Scion Capital, a hedge fund that had been successful investing in undervalued stocks. But in 2005, Burry began investigating subprime mortgages. He obtained the data at the loan level, the actual characteristics of the borrowers whose mortgage loans were packaged into securities. What he found was shocking. Adjustable rate mortgages given to borrowers who couldn't afford the payments once rates adjusted. Stated income loans where borrowers claimed income they didn't have without verification. Loans with promotional rates that would skyrocket after 2 years. The mortgages were junk. But they were rated AAA and marketed as safe investments. Burry concluded that this would collapse. But he couldn't directly short mortgage-backed securities. The instruments didn't exist. So he worked with Goldman Sachs and other investment banks to create a new instrument: mortgage-backed securities default swaps, essentially insurance policies that paid out if the bonds defaulted. From 2005 to 2006, Burry bought billions in notional value of credit default swaps. He was paying premiums, losing money every month while the housing market kept rising. His investors were furious. They thought he'd lost his mind. Some tried to pull their money out. But Burry understood stage one: get out of the consensus trade and position himself for the crash before anyone else saw it coming. John Paulson, running Paulson & Company, reached the same conclusion in 2006. He had studied housing prices in relation to income and rents. He analyzed mortgage underwriting standards. The bubble was obvious to anyone who actually looked at the data. Paulson launched a fund specifically to bet against subprime mortgages. He raised money from investors, bought credit default swaps, and waited. Like Burry, he endured months of losses and angry investors questioning the strategy. Both Burry and Paulson were in stage one from 2005 to 2007, exiting the consensus long position in housing and real estate stocks, building positions that would only pay out if the system collapsed. The housing bubble peaked in 2006. Subprime mortgage defaults began to rise in early 2007. The collapse accelerated during 2007 and 2008. Stage two of his strategy, buying volatility insurance, began to pay off. The contracts Burry bought for a few million in premiums paid out hundreds of millions when the underlying bonds defaulted. Paulson's fund, which bought tens of billions of dollars in notional insurance, collected $15 billion when it paid out. The premiums they paid over 2 years were negligible compared to the payout. Bill Ackman executed a perfect Stage 2 strategy in March 2020. When COVID hit and markets began to crash, Ackman bought credit default swaps on investment-grade corporate bonds. He spent $27 million on this insurance. Within weeks, as panic accelerated and markets plunged 35%, those swaps paid out $2.6 billion. That's a 96-to-1 return in less than a month. But here's the perfection of Stage 4. While he was on CNBC on March 18, 2020, giving an apocalyptic interview saying that hell was coming, that the economy was collapsing, that millions would die, that capitalism itself was at risk, his fund was simultaneously buying stocks with the cash from the payment of credit default swaps. He bought stocks he knew were fundamentally sound, but had been destroyed by panic selling. Starbucks, Hilton, Lowe's, restaurant brands. Companies that would recover when the panic ended. In 3 months, the Federal Reserve and the government intervened with unlimited stimulus. The markets,